This is the Mystery of Cabin Island, Chapter 4, and it's called A Christmas Visitor. Remember, it was Christmas Eve when we stopped at the end of the last chapter. As the Hardys drove on toward the Bay Area, they continued to discuss the missing boy. Remember the missing grandson. Mr. Jefferson appears to be very strict with his grandson, Joe observed. I'm not surprised that Johnny wanted to go off and prove he's old enough to be on his own. Frank frowned. Could be, but he's also old enough to realize fully the grief he's causing his grandfather. Upon reaching their boathouse, Frank parked behind a green sedan, which the Hardys recognized as belonging to the Hoopers. Biff and Chet hopped out to greet their pals. Joe and Biff unlocked both car trunks, and they all looked over the gear each had brought. It'll take some engineering to stow all this on the Seagull, Joe said with a groan. And don't forget, we have to leave some space for food, Chet reminded him. Biff scratched his head. It's all necessary, including my snowshoes. Chet has his, too. You're lucky, Frank replied. Ours gave out last winter, and we haven't had the money to get new ones. The four boys hauled their gear into the boathouse. The streamlined hull of the Seagull had been designed with plenty of space for cargo. Nevertheless, they packed it 3 times before they found places for everything. When they had finished, there remained only a few niches for boxes of food. That took at least an hour, Biff exclaimed. We'd better get going. Joe locked the boathouse. The friends wished one another a Merry Christmas, and Frank called out, "See you Saturday." At dinner, Frank and Joe told their family about Mr. Jefferson's mysteries. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy and Aunt Gertrude expressed concern about Johnny and hoped the missing boy would be found soon. It's kind of mysterious that he's going to skip Christmas with his family, isn't it? Most young people would want to be around great meals and things. Frank and Joe went upstairs early in the evening to wrap their gifts before going to bed. In the morning, the brothers awakened soon after the sun was up. "Merry Christmas," Joe called. "Same to you," Frank shouted as he leaped out of bed. The boys dressed and ran downstairs. "I can smell the turkey roasting already," Joe exclaimed as he reached the bottom step. Aunt Gertrude bustled out of the kitchen and scolded cheerfully. "I should hope you do. That gobbler weighs 30 pounds. Now I've made pancakes and sausage, and I want you both to eat properly before the confusion begins. Oh, and Merry Christmas." The boys ate the tasty breakfast with zest. Mrs. Hardy looked at her sons. "Mr. Jefferson was so kind to make your outing possible," she mused. "It's sad to think of him being alone on Christmas. Why don't we invite him to join us at dinner?" Joe grinned and said, "Mother, that's a great idea. I'll phone him." Frank hurried off to make the call. He returned shortly to announce that Mr. Jefferson had accepted the invitation. "I said Joe and I would pick him up on our way back from church." "Now for our presents," Joe urged impatiently. The Hardys went into the living room where the lights and ornaments shone brilliantly on the tall balsam. Balsam's a kind of tree. The boys were thrilled to discover that their mother had bought each of them a pair of snowshoes. Mr. Hardy gave his sons a self-developing camera. The brothers were overjoyed. Back before they had digital cameras, you had to put film in cameras, and then you had to take the film somewhere to get it developed, and it took a matter of days, and it was actually kind of expensive. And when you were taking the pictures, you never knew if they had turned out until after you had your film developed. Now with digital cameras, you can see immediately whether the picture's any good. And with the self-developing cameras, they used to spit a picture out, and you could see whether the picture was good or if you needed to take a new one. The brothers were overjoyed. "It's terrific. But what is this?" Joe asked, holding up an object that resembled a gun stock. His father explained that the attachment was a gun-type mounting to use in conjunction with the camera's high-powered telescopic lens. "You should find it very useful for long-range shots," he added. "A number of private investigators have purchased them." So you could mount it it's not on a gun, it's on something like a gun stock. So you can aim it and zoom out and see what you're photographing from a long way away. "Thanks," they chorused, and Frank added, "We'll take it to Cabin Island." From her sons, Mrs. Hardy received a colorful skirt and blouse set. Mr. Hardy was the happy recipient of handmade doeskin slippers, and Aunt Gertrude beamed over a tan cardigan sweater presented by her nephews. As for Frank and Joe, they were amused to discover that each had given the other a handsome leather watch band. I thought you'd like it because it appealed to me, Joe explained. Same here, Frank replied. Time for you to open my presents, said Aunt Gertrude as she handed each nephew a brightly wrapped package. Now you won't catch your death of cold in this foolish winter vacation. Joe opened his box first and drew out a pair of full-length red ski underwear. Well, thanks, he managed to blurt out. Frank's gift was a duplicate. Auntie, I can't wait to wear this, he said, grinning. He unbuttoned the bright crimson suit and pulled it on over his clothes. Joe did the same, and the boys clowned until even Aunt Gertrude was laughing hard. When Frank and Joe drove up to the Jefferson home later, the elderly man greeted them with "Merry Christmas, boys," but there was an agitated ring in his voice. Has anything happened, Mr. Jefferson? Frank asked quickly. The reply was startling. This morning I found a package on the doorstep. It's a present from Johnny. The old man held up the gift card bearing his grandson's name. This is Johnny's printing. There's no postmark, so the package wasn't mailed, Mr. Jefferson answered, and none of my neighbors lives close enough to have seen the person who left it, but there is a clue in the gift itself. From the hall table he took a round box and opened it. Ooh, a can of plum pudding, exclaimed Joe. My favorite dessert, said Mr. Jefferson. But this is the significant thing, he added, pointing to a cluster of fir cones tied clumsily onto the can with red ribbon. These are blue spruce cones, and Cabin Island has many trees of that variety. More than ever, I feel sure my boy is, or was, there. Perhaps your housekeeper could tell us when and how the parcel was delivered, Frank suggested. No, Mr. Jefferson replied. Mrs. Morley is away on a week's vacation. Mr. Jefferson donned his coat and locked the house. Then the three got into the car and Frank started for home. On the way, he tried to reassure the distraught man. Perhaps the gift is a sign that Johnny plans to come home soon. He probably wanted to get back to you into your good graces before returning. Mr. Jefferson frowned. That boy won't be back as long as he has the detective bug. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy and Aunt Gertrude welcomed their guest warmly, and he soon appeared to relax and enjoy the holiday atmosphere. By the time Frank and Joe drove their visitor home that evening, he was smiling. As Frank brought the convertible to a stop in front of the Jefferson house, Joe said, Sir, I have a strong feeling that Johnny is in this area. Will you describe him in detail? I'll do better than that. Come into the house and I will give you a recent snapshot. The Hardy boys followed Mr. Jefferson up the walk. He unlocked the door, stepped into the hall, turned on the light, then cried out in alarm. Frank and Joe gasped. Furniture had been overturned and drawers hung open, their contents scrambled and strewn about the floor. The antique wall ornaments had been ruthlessly torn down. The three hurried into the living room. It, too, was completely disordered. The thick rug was littered with articles that had been in drawers or displayed on shelves. The rich red draperies hung at crazy angles, and one of the crystal chandeliers had been shattered. Mr. Jefferson's face was white and his hands trembled. Frank suggested anxiously, You'd better sit down, sir. Joe and I will see if the person who did this is still on the premises. No, I'll be all right. I have some valuable antiques I must check on immediately. You boys look about. The Hardys soon discovered that entry had been made by jimmying the rear door. They made a thorough tour of the house and circled the grounds. Although the moon shone brilliantly, the young sleuths could find no clue to the marauder. There isn't even a footprint, Joe sighed as he and Frank entered the house again. Whoever it was evidently went right around the sidewalk to the back. Mr. Jefferson reported that nothing was missing, although many valuable objects had been broken. He handed Frank a snapshot of a tall, well-built boy. Here's the picture of Johnny. Frank placed the photograph in his wallet. You had better report this damage to the police, Mr. Jefferson, he advised. When the elderly man left the room to telephone, Joe murmured, I know it sounds Do you think Johnny is mixed up in this? No, Frank replied promptly. I can't believe he's that kind. A short time later, Lieutenant Daly of the Bayport Police Department arrived. He inspected the damage, took fingerprints, and then questioned the Hardys and Mr. Jefferson. The officer left, saying headquarters would notify them if any clues to the vandal turned up. The brothers went to bed as soon as they had told their father about the incident. We'd better get to sleep pronto if we're going to start early tomorrow, Joe said. The boys' alarm clock rang just as the sun was rising. Frank and Joe dressed, ate a quick breakfast, and gathered their supplies, among which were the Christmas gifts they had received. Chet and Biff were waiting outside the Hardys' boathouse when the brothers drove up. Hey, Joe exclaimed as he and Frank hopped out to meet them. What's all that? He pointed to piles of packages on the ground. Our Christmas presents, Biff replied. I got super binoculars, Chet crowed. And look, a portable ultraviolet light for identifying rocks and minerals. How about this? Biff broke in, holding up a large box. Barbells. I have the weights too, and fellows, Frank interrupted, we'll never fit all this stuff onto the Seagull. I see you and Joe brought some of your Christmas loot, Chet grumbled. Only what's really needed, Frank insisted, snowshoes and a camera. Chet, your binoculars will be great. The rest will have to stay in Bayport. Biff and Chet gave in grudgingly. My father drove us here, said Biff, but you'll have to drive us back to drop these things off. Sure. First, let's put the food in the Seagull, Frank said. The boys did so, then Joe locked the boathouse. The four went off in the convertible, and the extra items were returned to the Morton and Hooper homes. As Frank once more reached the bayfront parking area, a startled expression crossed his face. Didn't you lock up before we left? He asked Joe. Sure I did, Joe gulped. All four boys stared in disbelief at the area between the parked cars and the Hardys' boathouse. Their supplies, which had been stowed in the Seagull, were scattered in all directions over the ground. Boy, someone really doesn't want them to go, and I bet I know who it is, but we'll find out.